Aloha, everybody. It's Ajanette, and I am here to address your Module 2, Part A. So you have 2 weeks covering Module 2. This is the first of those weeks. So this is Part A of Module 2. We're going to start out talking about self and personality, and then for Part 2 or Part B, we're going to be addressing culture and personality. So when we talk about self in psychology, there's a number of selves to kind of work through. And so that's what this module is going to be about. The different aspects of ourselves and then how that relates to our personality development. This will just be another way that helps us understand and build our knowledge of various personality theories and understand the nuances and differences as we compare and contrast those theoretical perspectives. You have 2 readings for this week. So your lecture is drawing upon, first of all, a McAdams article, and that is a scholarly article that is written by McAdams and colleagues about self and identity in personality psychology. So referencing how self is incorporated into the field of personality psychology and how we study psychology, or excuse me, study personality. Additionally, the government of India invested in some open educational resources along these lines. And so we're going to draw upon their chapter 2 that was written by the National Council of Educational Research and Training. What I really appreciate about this resource is not only do they focus on some of the more commonly known and studied theories in personality psychology, they also kind of mention a couple of those that are born out of Indian scholarship. And so I think it's good to hear some other theories and names from diverse professionals and researchers in the field as well. So make sure you start with your chapter 2 reading, and that's going to go into understanding self and personality. Now, when we're talking about self, I want you to understand that, it encompasses a number of concepts, self-awareness, self-concept, self-identity, self-esteem, self-efficacy. And so we're going to talk about a number of those ideas during this module. Overall, when we're talking about self and personality and how those interact to shape who we are, we're really talking about understanding the very essence, all of the characteristics that define who I am as Ajanette, our very existence, right? So it's referencing how we experience the world, how we experience relationships, how they experience us to a large extent. It is referencing the ideas that we hold about ourselves, and maybe how those influence how we respond and how we engage the world around us. But they are typically traits that are stable within us, not just a fluctuating mood, but stable behaviors that are observable and evident. And when interviewing, let's say 10 people that know us, they're going to have pretty consistent descriptions of ourselves and our personality and who we are. When we're referencing the self, right? The self of Ajanette, where did that come from? It definitely was influenced by those around me. So there is a nurturing component. I have experienced certain things in the world, certain traumas in the world, certain characteristics, and I've internalized values as a result of those experiences. And myself is a reflection of those values and those influences. So it really is all encompassing. It's the totality of me, my knowledge, my experience, my values, how I think about the world, how I feel about the world, and those in it, right? So it kind of ties into the social identities that we touched on in your opening introductory module, where I had you reflect on your different identities, and those identities provide sometimes a category that serves as a source of community, comfort, familiarity for us, a way that we can define ourselves, but they also reflect aspects about us that influence the way the world defines and categorizes us and how the world responds to us. And so those are tied back to age, gender, sex assigned at birth, sexuality or sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, culture, ability, right? All those things that are kind of the lenses through which the world may see us, how they group us, categorize us, and we might find some community and connection in those groupings. It might help to enforce and sustain our own sense of identity, but it also influences maybe the privileges that we experience in the world, or maybe sometimes the marginalization that we experience in the world based upon where our identity lands on the social hierarchy. And that might be different from society to society and culture to culture, but these are our representative characteristics. So those outside salient characteristics that the world sees or responds to when they're known. So in this regard, self can be referred to as a subject, right? Like the self is doing something, feeling something, thinking something. So think of a subject and a verb, or a subject and a predicate. It is the thing doing, right? It is the thing taking action. It's a subject, but it can also be the object. It can be the thing being studied or the thing that is being observed. So in one sense, it is doing the observing. It is engaging in the behavior and the thinking and the feeling. And in another sense, it is being observed. It is being analyzed. It is being described. It might even be receiving or benefiting from a particular behavior or response that is observable to the outside world. So it's really interesting when we describe ourselves, we often describe ourselves as a subject or an object. We describe ourselves as I am a teacher, right? I am an object, or I am somebody who loves and has tremendous compassion and supports other people with all that I am, right? I can be the object, the doer, the giver. So when we're talking about our self, there are multiple selves. There's our biological self that really is talking about those inherent drives, my hunger, my thirst, my sex drive. Those are all kind of natural biological drives that are driven by that biological self. There's my personal self that might be a little bit more abstract in nature, thinking more about those psychological factors that can't always, be tangibly observed, but instead they're observed through my behaviors or through other actions that might be associated with that particular psychological concept or feeling. So it's more of a perception. How do I see myself? How do I perceive myself? What strengths do I perceive? And typically, we're talking about, me directly. And so there are things, when we talk about a personal self, we're very much looking at, our own autonomy, liberties, freedoms. And so things that are very individual and specific to me. Now, the social self is a little bit different, right? Now I'm focused on not just Ajanette as an individual and her individual independence and autonomy and freedom, but I'm talking about my social self, my connection to other people, my connection to relationships, to family, to my community, to my culture. So focusing more on that dynamic exchange between me and others. Do I feel unity? Do I feel connection? Do I feel support? Do I feel affiliation, connection, right? And that is now looking at more of a relational self, who I am in relation to my connections with others, family or otherwise. One moment. So, moving on into our self concept, right? So, when we talk about our self concept, we're talking about our overall perception of our abilities, our attributes, our strengths. Um, and that can coincide, it can inform self-esteem. In some scales and inventories and measurements, there's a lot of overlap, but self-esteem is more of an evaluation. It's an assessment of our worth, of our value. We typically talk about low self-esteem or high self-esteem, typically seeing high self-esteem as something that's more valuable, prized, stronger, more well-regarded, particularly in American culture. But in other cultures, like some Asian cultures, a high self-esteem might actually not be looked upon favorably in society. That might be a society that favors, or a culture that favors, humility more so than individuality. And so self-esteem is something that's highly prized in individualistic cultures, such as the US and other westernized cultures. Our physical appearance and our body image is very heavily tied into our self-esteem quite often in westernized cultures as well, because there's such very stringent ideas of attractiveness, and the beauty standards and ideals are very different and narrow and very closely tied to one's perceived worth, right? So those things are highly connected. That being said, research breaks down self-esteem to academic self-esteem, particularly among children, right? Like, do I value myself as a student? Do I see myself as a good student, a bad student? A social self-esteem. Am I well liked by peers or valued by peers or not? My physical ability, more so like my athleticism. Am I good at sports? Am I not good at sports? And my physical appearance. Am I attractive or not attractive, right? Or some variation thereof. So it can be broken up. It's not always a global self-esteem, but typically in adulthood, beyond childhood, we focus more on assessing global self-esteem quite often, but know that it can be much more nuanced than that. Now, self-efficacy is a little bit different than self-esteem. Self-efficacy is not focused on my inherent worth or value. It's focused on my competence. Do I believe I am capable? Do I believe I can achieve? Do I believe that I have skills and abilities that will allow for success? Do I believe I have control and influence over my own destiny and outcomes? That's really, really important. And when you talk about social learning theory, Albert Bandura's theory, when we look at a situation and we're observing a particular behavior or person, before we can actually model or imitate that behavior or skill, we have to believe in our ability and capacity to master that skill and learn that skill. And without that self-efficacy, we can't acquire those behaviors or adopt those behaviors or model that behavior. So self-efficacy is an important step or link or bridge in that social learning theory. It is something that can be developed over time. It's not something where they're born with or not. Actually, research suggests that a lot of our childhood experiences, even the literature that we read, the values that are expressed from your parents, those have a huge influence on your sense of self-efficacy. Then there's self-regulation. How do I manage myself? How can I, number one, have an awareness of what I'm feeling, thinking, my impulses, my desires? How do I organize those and monitor those inside my own psychological mind? And then how do I manage my behavior in response to those psychological thoughts, concepts, feelings, right? So self-regulation is having that awareness, right? Being able to monitor ourselves, understanding where we're at emotionally so I can regulate my emotions rather than just kind of fly off the handle. And that also is related to self-control, where I can delay an impulse. I don't have to act on everything I'm feeling. I can actually delay that gratification, or I can delay expressing that thought until maybe I can analyze it a little bit, unpack it a little bit, process it a little bit, and assess all the other factors that might be influencing how I'm responding in the moment, recognizing that maybe tomorrow I won't be responding in the same way. So I can sleep on it a bit, right? That's self-control. So how does this all relate to personality? Going back to some of that foundational information, right? This chapter does help to reiterate some of those core foundational concepts we learned in the first module. That personality comes from the word persona, which references the different masks or the different roles that we assume, that we perform in life. And when we're talking about our overall personality, it being a collection of our characteristics, our traits that are typically stable, persistent, very generalized descriptions that tend to be reliable across a number of situations. We each as individuals have a unique personality. It tends to be very stable. Ajeanette is Ajeanette for the most part, right? And no matter who you ask, they're going to describe me in a similar way. And across situations, I'm a similar person. I'm very authentic. I'm very transparent. I'm kind of raw. I'm a little funny. I'm definitely a bit of a cusser. You know, and, you know, in some ways, I'm, you know, can't make up my mind. I want a little bit of everything. And I share that very openly. I don't really have good filters, and that's pretty consistent, right? Those who really know my personality would describe me in very similar ways. And that's uniquely me. And that is why it is my personality. Now, can personality change over time? Is it dynamic? Am I the same person I was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Absolutely not. I'm committed to ongoing personal growth. I'm committed to lifelong learning. That learning means something to me. It impacts me and fundamentally changes who I am and how I see the world. And so, yes, personality can change, but it can still be stable. And that change is often, you know, a long-term gradual change versus a fluctuating mood. So we have differentiated between temperament and personality. And when we talk about temperament, that's a biologically based, genetically based way of characterizing someone. And it does kind of show almost their arousal level, their responsiveness. Babies are born with particular temperaments. Traits are the individual characteristics that tend to be stable within us and that are used to describe our personality. Our disposition is really our reaction. How do we tend to kind of carry ourselves? I do not have rainbows shooting out of my ass. I have a fairly kind of calm disposition, tend to be a little bit more reserved, particularly when you first get to know me. I tend to be more quiet. I sit back, I observe, right? That's my overall disposition, as opposed to a very dear friend and colleague who's happy and like cheerful and giddy and shooting rainbows out of her ass all the time. You ask her how she's doing. I'm fabulous. I'm fantastic. I'm great. I'm going to conquer the world today. You ask me how I'm doing. I'm fine, thank you. How are you? And that's pretty typical. I'm doing okay. You will almost never hear, I'm fabulous. Sometimes you might hear, I'm actually having a pretty shitty day, but very rarely do you find me as this elated disposition, right? My character is also stable. This is my pattern of regular behavior. I tend to be, you know, a very committed, dedicated, passionate person. I tend to be a very honest, giving, supportive person. And so you're going to find that character to be pretty solid and reliable over time. I also have particular habits that are reflected in my personality. And these are things that I've learned. They've become habitual. And like for me, I tend to be very food inspired. If anything's going to make me giddy, it's going to be an ice cream or a chocolate or a cookie, um, going out to a dinner that I love, right? But habits that I've developed aren't just related to eating, they're related to communication. They're related to even kind of the way I talk to myself and the way I value myself and the grace I extend myself or not. Those can be habits as well. And then certainly your values are those core driving forces, those ideals that you maintain, and what you consider to be important and meaningful in life. And for me, I value family, friendship, authenticity, transparency, integrity, work ethic, compassion, social justice. Those are all driving values in my life. I do want you to consider reflecting on your own values as well. We'll talk more about that later in the course. So how have we studied personality? Well, we've covered some of the different types, a type A, a type B. We talked about the fluid types, right? There are trait approaches that look at individual characteristics and traits. We'll get into some of the trait theories, specifically the big five. Trait theory is probably the most commonly discussed theory in psychology. And there's an interactional approach that says that you can have both types and traits that interact to shape a distinctive personality, right? It also looks at a different situation. So I am an introvert in a in a personal setting, but an extrovert in a professional setting. That type of interaction is another way of examining and studying personalities. Some of the type approaches that we've already talked about are the Hippocrates approach with the fluids, but also some new concepts that come up in this particular reading are the Chirag Samhita, which talks about 3 humors instead of 4s, and Prakriti, which are like temperaments that arise from those humors. This is an Indian psychologist, an Indian researcher who broke personality into 3 types, the Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And then there's the Triguna personalities, where you have a particular dominant personality, right? And that broke them down into the Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And the Sattva Rob was probably more like me, cleanliness, truthfulness, dutifulness, but the Tamas Guna is probably a little bit like me too. I can be a little lazy, and I can be prone to my emotions sometimes. And then the other one in the middle here is intense. They really think about that pleasure seeker or that sensation or thrill seeker. That probably falls into this as well, and feeling our emotions more intensely than maybe some of the other types. Other types that we haven't talked about as much is Sheldon's personality types, which really look at your body type and say, okay, are you an endomorph, a mesomorph, an ectomorph? And based upon that body type, it is a reflection of your personality. So an endomorph is more relaxed and sociable, and a mesomorph is energetic and courageous, and an ectomorph is brainy, artistic, introverted. So think about like you have an apple body type, a pear body type, right? It's just another kind of way of describing us or grouping us. Jung's personality theory really does dive into this notion of introversion versus extroversion. That does become a very prominent aspect of personality research and personality theory. It actually comes into the Big Five model that we'll talk about a little bit later on in the semester. But introverts Don't just think about whether they like to be in the spotlight or behind the scenes or in front of the camera. Think about it also like, where do they get their energy? What motivates them? Are they motivated when they're around people and energized when they're around people? And does that inspire new ideas and productivity, or does it drain them? Introverts tend to be exhausted after having a really highly social day. They tend to need to kind of raise up a tolerance level, and they're on guard a little bit when they're in large social environments, and they need to kind of re-energize and recharge. Extroverts love it, and they might actually feel more drained when they're alone for extended periods of time, or when they have to work on a project in a solitary way. They might need to bounce ideas and talk things through more often. So it's also kind of, how do they process? Oops, sorry. Another type approach is the Friedman and Rosenman personality type, with that type A and type B. And then later on, Morris extended that. And I think we talked a little bit about type A personalities, those really intense, high pressure, high demand, very stressful personalities. Not only do they internalize stress, but they can create stress and create a stressful dynamic for those around them as well. Type B tend to be more laid back, relaxed, easygoing, go with the flow. And there's health consequences associated with that. Type A are more at risk of heart attacks, coronary heart disease, high blood pressure. And some suggest that other personality types, like type C, Morris expanded this theory and said that type C, who tend to be more, I'm going to say, more of the carpet, right? Kind of, they cooperate, trying to please people. They're very unassertive. They really don't speak their own mind, tend to be patient, but they also can be prone to cancer, according to Morris. I'm not really, I mean, in some areas of my life, I could be described as a type C, but in other areas, I might be a type A. And in that regard, I don't think that cancer, I think cancer affects all of us regardless of personality type. Okay, and then finally, Alport, or not finally, contrarily, moving on to a trait approach, Alport and others don't just look at like general categories of personalities, but instead focus on the uniqueness of our personalities and what individual characteristics and qualities do we have that make us uniquely complex individuals, right? And so they focus more, rather than categorizing us, on identifying and understanding the dynamic nature of those individual traits and how they work together. And Alport is one of those trait theories that suggests that we have cardinal traits and we have central traits and secondary traits, with some being more of those prominent, those cardinal traits are more of the prominent traits within us. They're highly generalized. You're going to see these traits across situations, across interactions and relationships. Central traits you might see in most of the dynamics and most circumstances, but secondary traits are not quite as common, but they're still part of who we are, right? Maybe not in every setting, but part of who we are. Cattell's trait theories identified 16 specific traits, and those were broken into source traits and surface traits. He actually developed a 16 personality, or I should say the 16 personality factor questionnaire was developed in order to examine and assess some of these traits. Right now, for this learning activity, I'm going to have you focus on assessing some of the selves that are brought up in this chapter, but later on and throughout the semester, we will use some of these personality assessments and assess our personality from different lenses based upon the theoretical perspective we're studying. So we're doing kind of broad overviews of some of the theories now, but we'll get into greater detail in them. Eysenck, which we've discussed already, looking at your neuroticism and your emotional stability, which interestingly enough, very much was a huge driving force in Freud's theory, and neuroticism made it to the big five as well. Extroversion is on the big five as well, and that's really going back to that concept of our social ability and where does our energy come from. Then the big five, I rearranged it. The book had it in a different order. I like to use OCEAN as an acronym: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Openness referring to, are we open-minded? Are we open to new experiences? Are we open to different ideas and perspectives? Conscientiousness, are we reliable, dependable, get things done on time, responsible? Extroversion related to that energy and sociability quality. Agreeableness really related to that disposition toward others. Are we easy to get along with? Are we flexible? Are we just in generally friendly and kind and nice, right? And neuroticism is our emotional stability. Are we really intense and neurotic and hard to be around? Do our emotions fluctuate? Are we high strung? Are we really super anxious? Or do we tend to have more stable emotional expression? All of those things later on in the semester, we'll do a big five assessment on you as well. So you all have heard different versions of the psychoanalytic approach by now. This is a very influential theory in personality psychology because Freud was, in fact, the first big theorist in personality theory and psychology. And so he talked about those three levels of three levels of consciousness, with the unconscious being a huge prominent force in our personality. There's the conscious, the things that we're aware of, the preconscious, which are just outside of our awareness, but with a little bit of prodding. Oh yeah, I see I am being cranky because X, Y, and Z happen. I probably wouldn't have gotten as emotional or upset about that particular thing, right? And then the unconscious are buried deep into the abyss. We don't know or recognize their influence on us. And they can be shaped by our early childhood experiences. They can be shaped by these conflicts that emerged in our different personality components, that id, ego, and superego, and that kind of wrestling match. And maybe the ego wasn't able to be a good moderator between that pleasure principle and that morality principle. Maybe we didn't find common ground. Maybe there was trauma or conflict between these driving forces and these impulses that are buried deep within our unconscious that influence our personality. Maybe that's why we're neurotic, right? And so Freud had a very kind of abstract, very difficult theory to gain evidence for, to prove. There weren't a lot of concrete concepts that could be tested. And so consequently, it's not well supported by the research. It doesn't explain things as well as many other theoretical approaches. And it's largely been abandoned. And so the psychodynamic theory is a more modern version of psychoanalytic theory that moves away from some of the sexual undertones and doesn't suggest that the unconscious is as critical and stuck and rigid and in control of our personalities and our lives. The psychosexual theory of development really is explaining the different stages that we go through that shape our personality. We go through an oral stage where we have tremendous focus around our oral needs. Our pleasure center is our mouth. And of course, this is in infancy. Babies need to eat, right? And so they learn about the world through their sensory experiences orally. They put everything in their mouth, right? The anal stage is in toddlerhood when the focal point is on potty training. Also developing a sense of self and competence and autonomy and control. Gaining control over one's body allows one to recognize the power one has over themselves and they have a say. So a 2-year-old saying no or mine, that is a reflection of their growing and emerging sense of self and autonomy. So it's a very powerful thing to watch that transition psychologically. Freud suggested because the central point was on, the anal region, that was the pleasure center. That's where the primary needs were, and they needed to be met and supported. And if they weren't, then they could become fixated or stuck. The phallic stage is in those preschool years, and that's when they really do start to become aware of their own genitals. They might even start to pleasure themselves. Freud kind of got a little twisted here, and he said that Oedipus and Electra complex are central driving forces in our lives, our personality development, suggesting that little girls have an attraction and desire to marry their fathers. Mother is a source of competition, and they have penis envy from their dads, and so they bond with dad in order to gain a sense of power, and they want mom, gone out of their way, eliminated as competition. And the Electra complex is the opposite, where little girls fall in. Hold on, wait. The Oedipus complex is little boys falling in love with their mom and want dad out of the way, and Electra is little girls falling in love with their dad and wanting mom out of the way. So I mixed that up a little bit on the explanation. Keep that in mind. Oedipus applies to little boys who fall in love with their mom, and Electra is little girls who fall in love with their dad. Elementary school age or middle childhood is latent. Everything kind of goes dormant. Not the case. Freud got that all wrong. And then the genital phase in adolescence, where they're going through puberty, their genitals are growing and changing, and sexual desires start to emerge. So an aspect of Freud's theory I don't think we've talked about yet is this notion of defense mechanisms. Because there's so many unconscious elements of our personality and our psychological functioning, our unconscious actually has ways of protecting us, protecting our psyches and our psychological well-being. And defense mechanisms are one such mechanism, right? Where unconsciously we behave or think or perceive in a certain way in order to protect ourselves from psychological harm. Repression is one defense mechanism where Freud just says our psyche just shoves it into our unconscious. We just forget about it. We don't think about it. We have no awareness of it. And so consequently, we're protected from it. And I will say, I don't really align well with Freud's theory. In fact, I'm probably a little biased against his theory, in all honesty. But defense mechanisms is something where I kind of identify a little bit. Now, I will also say he really came up with the concept of defense mechanisms. He came up with a concept of these unconscious tools that we use to protect our psyche. And he certainly came up with the concept of repression. But Anna Freud, his daughter, she actually did further research on this, and she expanded and cultivated this theory. And she actually broke down far more defense mechanisms than Freud himself ever mentioned. But again, this was during a time when women's intellect and knowledge was not valued. Our voice was not valued. So Freud's often given the credit, but Anna Freud did a lot of the work for this theory. So that being said, I am a suicide loss survivor. My brother took his own life when I was 19 years old. He was 23. I held his body in my arms. It was a very traumatic experience. I can tell you where I was when I got the call, what I was doing, who told me that my sister was on the phone. I can tell you the words my sister told me. I can tell you about my drive from the bank to the house. I can tell you about stopping in the middle of the road. I can tell you the shoes that I was wearing that day, the outfit that I was wearing today. That's how really clear my memories are. I can visually see the fire truck in the middle of the road and the firemen walking out to ask me, like, do I know where he is? And I'm like, you don't know where he was? I'm the one that ran to the house and actually arrived there before the fire truck and the firemen. And I swooped my brother up and took him into my arms. And I can tell you what he was wearing and what he looked like and how he was sitting and where he was sitting and all of those things. But I cannot tell you about the wound. And it was a gunshot wound, so there was definitely a wound. But when I recount these memories in my mind, and as visual and graphic as they are, I do not see a wound. And that is an example of repression. And Freud would suggest that that repression is protecting me. It's protecting my personality development and giving me the freedom to not carry that wound and trauma with me that could potentially be detrimental to my personality development. So I definitely get the logic there. Um, Projection is another mechanism where we're kind of blaming others for our own feelings. We project our own feelings or attributes onto someone else. So, um, my ex-husband accused me of cheating and he was super jealous. Why? Because he was a cheating bastard and he was out there philandering. And so he projected that onto me and accused me of cheating all the time, right? You gotta look at the fingers pointing at you, dude. Um, Denial. That's when you're just like absolutely refusing to accept that there's a problem. You see this commonly with alcoholism or drug addiction. My dad for years and years and years refused to acknowledge that he was an alcoholic, that it was a problem, that it was interfering with his relationships and functioning. Reaction formation is when I behave opposite of what I believe, right? So it's really interesting. We have these politicians that are absolutely anti-LGBTQ everything. They are up there preaching on a very religious pulpit and this is not natural and we need to protect our children and protect the family and yet they're having a same-sex affair with a volunteer that's working for them or an intern that's working for them, right? That's reaction formation. Rationalization is basically when I can make excuses for something. I can justify it. This is acceptable because, right? And I rationalized my ex's behavior. His dad died when he was 5. He was raised by a Japanese mother who immigrated during World War II, experienced a tremendous amount of religion, didn't express emotion, was what we might perceive as cold in American society, never gave him an opportunity to grieve. He never knew how to feel intimacy and connection and love. So consequently, I rationalized his detachment. I rationalized his narcissism. I rationalized his sociopathic tendencies, and I tolerated a lot of abuse for a long time. So think about these defense mechanisms more exist, but think about how they might apply to you and how they might be manifested in your own personality. And that's likely something we'll come back to in a future learning activity. Jung is another famous psychoanalytic theorist. He really had some brilliant concepts as well. The notion of this concept of being a fully integrated self, right? He suggested our personalities were these compilations of competing forces, and we needed to come to a place of peace acceptance. We needed to understand these competing demands on us, our time, our energy, our emotions. And in order to really be at peace, we needed to become a fully integrated self that accepted our dark sides, our shadow sides is what he called it, and our positive sides as well. He also suggested that we have a personal unconscious that's comprised of our own experiences and manifested from our own childhood experiences, but we also inherit this collective unconscious that's comprised of all these archetypes from previous generations, where we have kind of these frameworks, these schemas. An anima and animus archetype which tells us what traits are appropriately masculine versus feminine. And interestingly enough, these drive our personality. It's really interesting because we do find a genetic basis for personality. Personality can be inherited. I may have never had a relationship with my grandmother, but I can have a lot of her personality traits. Jung described it as a collective unconscious. Now we know it's actually inherited through our DNA. So I feel like his was kind of maybe a foreshadowing, brilliant uh, observation, right? Maybe he didn't define it exactly in the same precise way that genetics allow us to do now. Horney, analytical psychology, we've talked about this. And we've talked about this inferiority complex with Adler's theory as well, and how really both of these theories are trying to kind of find redemption, right? And making up for perceived adequacies either that we have within ourselves or that the world imposes on us due to sexism and patriarchy, as would be explained in Horney's theory or Adler's theory, due to our own sense of inadequacy that might develop in childhood when we're not good at something or we're not able to achieve something and we don't feel like we're good enough. Then there's Fromm's theory, which really is focusing more on a social element of our development and our growth and personality. And I really like this because it almost starts to lean into a humanistic perspective, looking at our potential from within, and still very much talking about how our experience shape our personalities, but still giving rise and credit to the idea that we do have a potential and a desire to be good, to do good, to achieve good for ourselves and others. So I really appreciate that. And then Erikson's psychosocial theory that suggests that we really are influenced by our social relationships and our sense of connection and desire to be affirmed and empowered through those relationships and resolve our psychosocial crises throughout life that can be resolved in a healthy way to foster a healthy sense of identity, or in a negative way that might undermine our sense of confidence and ability moving forward. Then the behavioral approaches that we've talked about that really focus on those exterior forces, those experiences, that nurturing the world shapes us through classical conditioning and the pairing of stimulus response that we observed with Pavlov, and the salivation and the food stimuli, or Watson, where he conditioned little Albert to be afraid of a little white bunny. And an instrumental, also known as operant conditioning by B.F. Skinner, where he was looking at how consequences can shape our behavior, either reinforcing behavior and increasing behavior, or punishing behavior and decreasing behavior. And we'll get into those in greater depth in later in the semester as well. And then finally, Bandura social learning theory, which is effectively observational learning or modeling, right? We observe, we see our mom behave a certain way, our mom has certain traits and dispositions, and then we model that, we imitate that. And that is observational learning with Bandura. And then some cultural approaches, which I think are critical and important to consider, how culture is a huge aspect of our personalities. Even looking at like Hawaiian culture, right? My aunties raised in the islands have a humility, a grace, that aloha. They don't just say it, they live it, they breathe it. It's a part of who they are. My aunties raised on the continent, still wonderful women, but far more empowered, strong, deterministic, individualistic, right? So just very different. So when we think about culture, that Hawaiian culture, we were on an island. We needed to be dependent upon one another. We had a reverence for the island because we were dependent upon the island, right? And so thinking about what was accessible, what did the geography, the land produce and provide, what kind of terrain. Think about people in the Ka'u district who tend to be a little bit more sterner, sturdy, more resilient. And that land, that geography is a little harsher. They had to deal with more of the lava flows and some of the harsher conditions, right? And that might be very different from someone in Waimea or in the Waipio Valley, right? So just that geography, that terrain can be reflected in who we are in our personalities. So it's really cool and beautiful to see how these cultural and views of climate and personality are all intertwined and how they're reflected in the Hawaiian culture. That culture and that climate and geography can be such beautiful tools at shaping who we are as people. So all of that is sewn in. And then one of my favorites is the humanistic approach. Love Carl Rogers. He actually is one of the foremost contemporary researchers and theorists, suggesting that our personality is largely driven by our desire to be a fully functioning self, who is loved and feels loved and offers love and support to those around us, suggesting that we can thrive and heal and grow in environments that give us that unconditional positive regard, that help us understand our value and our worth, regardless of mistakes we may have made, regardless of flaws that we may have. And suggested that our behavior is intentional and goal directed, that we strive toward growth, that we're not stuck and fixated in pathology from our childhood, as Freud would say, that it's not these unconscious forces, but something within our control and our power to change, direct, to heal. And I really, really appreciate and value that theoretical approach because it allows for growth. And I'm somebody that deeply values growth. So hopefully in my classrooms, you do feel unconditional positive regard. I do hope I have created a safe space where you feel like you can be whole and a fully functioning person, acknowledging your faults, acknowledging your opportunities for improvement and growth, and I can give you that love and encouragement and teach you how to be a source of encouragement for yourself to foster growth moving forward. And then Maslow's theory that suggests that we're striving towards self-actualization, but we need to have our basic needs met, our basic physiological needs in terms of water and food, right? Warmth, rest, sex, our safety needs. We can't be constantly worried about, are we in danger? Our sense of connection to others. Can we belong to a group? Do we feel like we are part of a community, something bigger than ourselves? And then once we're in that community, we have esteem needs. We want to feel valued, important in that community, right? And then once those needs are met, then we can fully achieve our full potential. We can become all that we're capable of being, even in a learning environment. That's when we can achieve our full potential and self actualize, as Maslow called it. So that's kind of the gist of that OER module. I love that it incorporates the foundations, but then builds on it with these ideas of self and ties that back into personality. And we'll dive into some of those theories. Along comes McAdams, a more recent research publication that really is a really good summation of some good literature and findings about self and identity and those connections to personality, and kind of calling out the field of personality psychology. They really kind of give us a really good array of definitions to some of these important self concepts, self identity, selfhood, right? Um, and help you to understand the various dimensions of self and how they tie together and how they connect back to our personality. So, self identity is really a reflection of all of these different conceptions of self, right? That some that we've already talked about, some that McAdams, like this idea of selfhood, like personhood, right? We have this self-awareness of who we are and how that relates to others, how our positionality, right? Looking at kind of who we are and our different characteristics and traits and identities, and how that affects, uh, our place in the world, and how we might interpret and view ourselves and understand ourselves differently as a result. Talking about the power and magnitude of the self. The self is who you are as a human being, right? It is it is all of you. Without the self, there is no you. Without personality, you're just a body, a vessel, right? So this self has huge consequential magnitude for understanding the reason and purpose of our existence, right? How we perceive ourselves, our self-awareness, and how we define that. And this is something unique to human beings. All human beings have this capacity to some extent or another. Um, it might be a pathology if perceived as a pathology if you're limited in that kind of self-awareness and self-analysis. And certainly, depending upon your cultural background, they may value that self-awareness and analysis differently. They might prize it differently, right? They might encourage it, support it, train it differently. But most definitely, it influences how we think about ourselves, others, and the world. It influences how we feel about ourselves, others, and the world. And it influences how we engage with ourselves, others, and the world. So that behavior. So it's that all encompassing compilation of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And it influences everything about our lives and everything we feel about ourselves. It's also related to self-compassion. Do we offer ourselves love, grace, kindness, flexibility, compassion? Do we treat ourselves or give ourselves the same support that we might offer a friend? Or do we beat ourselves up? Do we criticize ourselves? Are we harsh on ourselves, say mean things, and sometimes cruel to ourselves? Step back and ask yourself, if my best, most cherished friend were experiencing this, made this mistake, had this flaw, did this thing wrong, would I beat them up the same way that I beat myself up? What words or advice would I offer them? Shouldn't you offer it to yourself as well? That's self-compassion. I'm going to encourage you to practice self-compassion throughout the semester and all life long. So, self and identity are critical elements of our personality. That self conception is a core part of who we are. If we don't love and value ourselves, we don't offer ourselves grace, and we hold ourselves to unachievable and unimaginable standards, it might be reflected in our personality, how we engage ourselves in the world, right? What kind of validation are we seeking from those around us? Are we having to go out and prove ourselves all the time? Are we so demanding that we're also demanding on others? Um, you know, if we're so critical toward ourselves, do we also, apply that same kind of judgment toward others? So think about those things. Think about how your personality is influenced by how you perceive yourself. Think about opportunities for growth in the areas of grace and compassion and kindness and aloha. Aloha toward yourself, not just others. It's not something we give, it's also something we practice within ourselves. When we talk about our awareness of ourself, of our identity, of our personality, it tends to be pretty accurate, right? We tend to have a good understanding and realistic understanding of our talents, our abilities, our skills, whether we're liked or not liked, how attractive we are to the world. We tend to have pretty good assessments in general. Some of us might lean a little bit more toward low self-esteem, self-loathing, or some personality disorders can have a completely warped and demented perception of themselves. And sometimes when you're neurotic or you're a little bit more arrogant, you might actually view yourself more favorably than you should. Um, and certainly narcissistic people do that as well. So we have to really think about um, where do these self-perceptions come from, right? What predicts whether they're accurate? Certainly our environmental experiences, our motivations, certainly there's biology and neurology, how we perceive the world, our mindset. Do we have a growth mindset, a fixed mindset? Those are all huge parts of our personality. And those are some things that we'll measure about ourselves and gain some insight into our own personality. Not here to psychoanalyze others, but we are here to promote healthy self-reflection, healthy self-awareness, healthy self-concept, and ideally healthy self-love, worth, esteem, and compassion over time. So when we're talking about problems with self and identity, that can be manifested in psychological disorders, right? Where psychopathology comes when there's a lack of cohesion between our self-perceptions and reality, right? Schizophrenia is a breaking of this of the understanding of self-awareness. They can't differentiate between their voice and other voices. They have a very distorted perception of themselves and reality as a whole, and they cannot control their own thoughts and feelings. So that self-awareness, that self-regulation, that self-control that we talked about is absolutely not functionally operational in an individual with schizophrenia, and to varying degrees, right? Because schizophrenia is viewed as a spectrum disorder. So people can have varying degrees. They can have some symptoms and not others, and varying degrees of those symptoms being expressed. Eating disorders might be another example of a conflict between self and identity and how that's manifested in our personality and our behaviors. For instance, a lot of people with eating disorders have body dysmorphia, where they, no matter how thin they are, when they look at themselves in the mirror, they see a heavy reflection looking back at them. And that distorted body image influences their self-esteem and influences their eating, that excessive control over what they eat, how much they eat, when they eat. All of that is kind of a compulsive need to make up for that distorted sense of themselves and their appearance. And it's often heavily tied to a need to control, a sense of control. They may not feel like they have control in other areas of their lives. Self also is highly tied to our emotions, right? Particularly self-conscious or secondary emotions that are often conditioned, and they're predicated upon the society and culture in which we live and the underlying cultural values. Pride, shame, guilt, embarrassment, all of these things are very much dictated by the society in which we live. Um, you know, failure might be defined differently depending upon your cultural background. And, you know, running out on your own and conquering something on your own might be prized in westernized cultures, but in collectivist cultures, that might be something you should be ashamed of, that it's not all about individual achievement, but the collective well-being of the whole and the community. So really think about what cultures value, what societies value, and what earns you greater social accolades or esteem, and that very much can influence what you would consider to be something to be proud of, ashamed of, guilty about, or embarrassed about. So here is just kind of a scroll through the different stages of life and that infancy and toddlerhood, early childhood, a middle childhood, adolescence, and what kinds of conceptions about self might emerge at the different stages of life, and some narrative and qualitative descriptions that help us understand how we might recognize these various aspects of selves and how they are developing and emerging at these different life periods. Self-esteem was addressed in the chapter 2 reading by the NCERT, but it's also addressed in this reading as well. The McAdams article really talks about self-esteem as being something that tends to be stable over time. In other words, I don't have low self-esteem one day and high self-esteem another. I typically might demonstrate low self-esteem in various aspects of my life, but we do keep in mind that there are those different situations, particularly in childhood, and those different classifications: the academic, the athletic, the appearance, and the social self-esteem. And so we definitely understand those different categories. We definitely understand that self-esteem can change and evolve with age and time. We specifically have research to show that it typically tends to kind of increase over childhood. This article talks about it really continuing to plateau and increase and plateau in adolescence and peak in adulthood. And other research actually suggests that it actually is good in childhood, can decline in adolescence, and then it can improve and grow into adulthood. And then in late adulthood, it can actually dip and start to decline again as our abilities decline. As we become more dependent upon others, our self-esteem can change. So definitely understand that there are kind of common life patterns that we found across similar societies, so westernized societies. And a lot of this research is born out of Western cultures. So in that regard, it could be biased as well. And when we talk about identity, I want you to think about the narrative nature, the oral histories, right? You are data. Your story, your molelo, it's data. It's your identity. Your stories are who you are. So we are a construction, a compilation, a mosaic of our experiences, of the stories of our lives, right? Of our autobiographical story. And so It's beautiful to think of the concept of that narrative identity and how it's reflected in those stories, in those memories, and that autobiographical memory that really emerges in childhood, but really starts to solidify in adolescence. And we have these wonderful themes that emerge from the stories that we hold, that we prize, that we tell and retell. Some of those center around motivation and emotion. When we talk about affect in psychology, we're talking about emotional expression, right? Um, and so, do I feel capable, powerful? When did I start to take control and a sense of agency and power and voice? What were the times that gave me that motivation, that connection, that communion, that positivity? We also think about those narratives, those stories, molelo, where there was meaning and value. Where were the life lessons gained? Where were the epiphanies, those realizations and insights? Um, my brother's death was such a powerful experience in my life. It was life changing. Um, and then structural qualities, like, you know, structural times in our lives, like when we got married or bought our first home, right? The way we tie and piece our lives together, often as parents and grandparents. We start to organize our lives around when our children were born or how old they were. And some of our memories and our stories are connected back to that sequence. Um, there's also, particularly when you're talking about post traumatic growth experiences, these themes of redemption, of insight, of making the world a better place, of learning from our trauma and helping others, being inspired to make a difference in the world and reduce risks for those that come behind us. And so, very critical central themes that emerge in midlife and late life, according to Erickson's theory and his notion of ego development. So we'll talk more about that when we revisit his theory in greater depth. And then also in Ode to Culture again, and I cannot emphasize this enough, culture is so important, and McAdams acknowledged that as well. Those different senses of self, those complex versions of self that we have, they engage and intersect with this sociocultural world around us. It's a complex interplay that has a profound impact on our identity and who we are, right? Each culture has different values that are at their core, and we internalize those things. And in many cases, we adopt those values for ourselves, and then that shapes how we interpret the world and how we perceive ourselves and others. It shapes our sense of normal, of right, of wrong within ourselves and within others. And so they can be powerful influences. It also shapes how we perceive politics, what our values are, what our affiliation is. How do we define ourselves in terms of our religion, our faith, our political, our party, even our profession? It shapes who I am as a teacher. It shapes how I approach the classroom. It shapes how I receive students' concerns about late work or, missing class, right? All of those things. My responses are shaped by my values. I'm always going to lean toward grace. I'm always going to lean toward family and prioritizing your well being and the needs of your family. Why? Because I'd like to believe I've internalized the values of aloha in my culture, right? And so I want to wrap you in a pedagogy of love and aloha, and I want that to be manifested in how I treat you as a teacher. So Culture has a profound influence on our various senses of self, on our self concept, self identity, self compassion, self esteem, self efficacy, and it most definitely influences our personality development now and throughout life. And ideally, I'm hoping you will embrace your own cultural identity with greater love, appreciation, joy. But I also want you to take some time and space to appreciate the diverse cultures of those around you. And that's one of the beautiful things about Hawaii is there is such a diverse population, and it really does help us have a stronger, more accepting and supportive global identity and appreciation. And so embrace that, support that. So, in terms of research, McAdams suggests that there's definitely a need to continue to understand how our lived experiences shape who we are, but not just in childhood, where a lot of the theories have focused in the past, but throughout life. We continue to have personalities that evolve and are influenced by critical experiences that extend well beyond childhood. We also need to have a neuroscientific lens as we learn more about the brain. We need to continue to examine what the brain can teach us about personality and our sense of identity and how those work together and influence our overall psychological functioning. And we need to understand how we can leverage our self and identity, how we can promote healthy sense of self and identity in a way that can support healthy personality development throughout life. Overall, how can we leverage research to understand how we can make ourselves better, healthier, and more thriving personalities? And so as we wrap up this module, I want you to make sure you're doing your reading, which includes those 2 readings I've referenced in this lecture. Make sure you're doing your notes, both through the reading and through your lectures. And then, of course, you will have a learning activity, as always, to dig in a little bit deeper and analyze these concepts in a new and distinct way and apply it to your own life so you can better understand your personality and those around you. And so I'm going to ask you to do that with the spirit of grace, love, and aloha always. Offer love and aloha to yourself and offer it to others. Much, much love to all of you. Aloha.